Hi everybody, this is Dr. Brenda Barnes, and welcome to the seminar on writing objectives for health sciences educational programs. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So what we plan to cover within this seminar and what I will be covering within this lecture is for you to be able to state the purpose of learning objectives by the end of this course, and then also explain how you develop learning objectives that are appropriate for a health sciences educational setting. You'll also have an opportunity to write some learning objectives and get some feedback on objectives that you've created that are appropriate to your setting. And we'll also talk about some strategies that help your learners use objectives to study and better understand what outcomes you have intended for them by the end of a module or a course or whatever activity you're working on. Most health sciences educational programs require instructors to write objectives. This is also true for most accreditors that are in the health sciences realm. But to make sure that we're on the same page as we work through this seminar, what exactly are learning objectives? So one definition I found is this is a way for instructors to tell students what the intended learning outcomes are for an instruction or an activity or a course. And so by writing learning objectives, it provides a focus for the instruction, and it also tells the learners what kind of tasks they're going to be doing as part of the instructional unit. And it also provides a basis for assessment for student achievement. So students know how they are doing in relation to the learning objectives that are set forth for a unit or a course or a module. And so a good question to ask when you're starting out writing learning objectives is, what do you want your students to be able to know or do, and how will they show achievement of those particular objectives or outcomes or activities? As I said on the previous slide, objectives and instruction kind of go hand in hand, but why exactly do we need them? Well, depending on where you work, your institution may require them as part of the instruction that you put together for a course or a unit. Depending on your accreditor, you may have accreditation that has an outcomes-based component, and this could be true for a specific accreditor such as nursing or laboratory science or other specific health sciences educational programs, but also your institution may be accredited by, for example, in the Midwest, here we are accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. So there could be a couple layers of accreditation that require objectives. And also students expect to see them. Some students may not know what an objective is, but a lot of students do expect to see the objectives so they know exactly what's going to be covered. I've been using some language on the previous slides where I've talked about a module or a unit or activity, and so this feeds into there are different levels of objectives that are usually required in an educational setting directed at health science education. So the lowest level of objectives that are generally seen within a course are specific module or unit or objectives that are related to a specific activity. Next up, there generally are course level objectives, although some institutions may prefer to have course goals. And then depending on the type of program that you teach within, there may be program level objectives, but there are other terms that may be used for these higher level objectives. They may be called competencies or outcomes. However, one thing as I mentioned earlier, objectives should not be confused with goals. Goals are usually broad statements that aren't necessarily directly measurable, where the intent of an objective is that it includes a verb that has a measurable activity, one that you can assess and you can give students a result as far as how they performed based on that objective regardless of the level. So on the right side of this slide, I do have some objectives, or I have some examples of objectives that relate to the laboratory science program that that I teach within. So you can see these objectives. I have two verbs here that relate. So these are course level objectives, and then the lower order objective is a module or a unit level objective, so that you can see how the course level objective is much more broad or general, and then as we drill down to the module or the unit level objective, it's much more specific. And now we're at the information that is probably of most interest to you. How do you write them? If you see objectives that are written already, it seems like, oh, this is a breeze. These should be easy to write. But when you actually sit down and try to write your own objectives, it can be quite a complicated process. So how do you inherit, or how do you write objectives? So if you're a newer instructor, you may have some objectives that have been given to you. For example, maybe the course had been previously taught by another instructor, or there may be a previous section of the course that was taught. And so you may have specific objectives that you have to teach within a particular course. You also may have objectives that are directed by your accreditor or your institution. Again, these are the things that you need to cover within this course, and so please direct your instruction to these objectives. You also may be required to create your own. And therein lies the problem. If you have to create your own, you may be feeling a little bit overwhelmed. How do you write a good objective? And so, again, some advice that I can give you is consider in performance terms what your students or participants are like when they have learned what is expected of them. Use that as a broad guiding statement when writing an objective. And now you may be saying to yourself, well, that sounds all well and good, but that doesn't tell me how to write an objective. And so I have a recipe here for you, and we're going to spend the next few slides going over this particular objective recipe that I have found that works really well for me. So a recipe for a good objective means that we have a performance, which is a verb or an action word. We have conditions, and then we have criteria or performance level. So we'll talk about each of these separate sections in the next few. So the first step in writing an objective is indicating to the learner what performance you would like them to be able to do at the end of a set of instructions. So this is communicated to learners through verbs, specific verbs that you choose. And the verb needs to communicate what it is that you want the learner to perform. And it should describe an action, one that can be observed and measured. Other things to consider when you're choosing the type of performance that you want learners to display. There are different levels of learning, and this is indicated by the taxonomy level of an objective that you're writing. And we'll discuss taxonomy levels in a few slides. But over on the right-hand side of this slide, I wanted to give you some examples of poorly written objectives and well-written objectives. The top statement in the green that says, by the end of this unit, students will, that's a condition, and we'll talk about conditions on the next slide. The first objective that is listed here is, by the end of this unit, students will be given opportunities to learn effective patient care skills. Well, this isn't a good objective because the verb does not communicate what it is to be performed. What we're saying with this objective is the students will be given opportunities, but how do you measure getting opportunities? So this is really more of a goal statement, or what you plan as part of an instructional activity. So it's not a good objective because it does not indicate the performance learners should be able to perform at the end of the unit. The next objective, by the end of this unit, students will have a deeper appreciation for patient care skills. That sounds good. That's something that we want our learners to be able to do, is to appreciate the skills that it takes to take care of a patient. However, in terms of performance, we don't have a verb that communicates what is to be performed. Have a deeper appreciation. How do you measure that? That is something that we may consider as part of the affective the affective domain, and we'll talk about different learning domains in a few slides. Objective number 3, by the end of this unit, students will understand principles of patient care. That old understand verb is one that that haunts instructors. As instructors, I certainly do want my students to be able to understand different principles, different procedures, different skills. But understand is a very difficult verb to measure. So generally, what most learning opportunities that for writing objectives indicate that understand is a poor verb to use in terms of objectives. That's more of a goals statement, because that's ultimately what we want our learners to be able to do, but that's a goal rather than an objective. Finally, the fourth objective listed here, by the end of this unit, students will discuss effective methods of patient care. That one has a performance verb that communicates what it is to be performed, and it's an action that we can observe and we can measure. So objective number 4 is the best one of this set that's displayed on the slide. As I indicated on the previous slide, there are different taxonomy levels in terms of objectives. So as we start at the bottom of this pyramid, the knowledge level is the least sophisticated level of understanding, if you will. Again, understanding is not a great objective verb, but ultimately that's what instructors want their students to do, is to understand. However, how we operationalize understanding goes through a complex level of learning. So again, knowledge is level number 1 in terms of learning. And as we move up the pyramid, learning becomes more sophisticated. So at the top of the pyramid, the skills that you need in order to evaluate a learning situation are much higher order than those for knowledge or comprehension. So depending on what you want your learners to be able to do at the end of an instructional unit or a course, you can indicate the level of sophistication of their learning by choosing a verb that corresponds with a different taxonomy level. This slide includes sample verbs that are organized by taxonomy level. So as we indicated on the previous slide, the knowledge and comprehension levels of taxonomy are less sophisticated levels of learning. And as we move to the right and we get to the evaluation stage, that shows much more complicated tasks in terms of what we're asking our learners to be able to do. So for example, on the left-hand side, under the knowledge level of taxonomy. So defining or identifying, those are much simpler levels of learning as compared to when we get to the synthesis and evaluation. So as a learner continues to use information and has more complex learning in place, they can take a term that they've defined, and then once they have a better understanding of those concepts, then later on in the course or in the unit, they can construct or design or even critique based on information that you've provided. So again, if, for example, through a course, module number 1, you may be presenting information that is more at the knowledge or comprehension level, but then by the time you get to the final exam, you want your students to be able to do things that are on the right side of this slide: synthesize, evaluate, even analysis, even though that's there in the middle. Those are more sophisticated levels of learning and displaying learning. Again, as I mentioned on a previous slide, there are different learning domains. So generally, when we write objectives for health science educational programs, we're writing objectives for most commonly the cognitive or the psychomotor domain. So the cognitive domain that's our cerebral knowledge. That's information that we contain in our brains to be able to perform or provide information on a topic, or even what we need to know before we can perform a skill. Psychomotor domain, that's our skill domain. That's when we're doing something that requires hands-on, or that's the doing domain. The affective domain, way to describe that is that's our appreciation domain, our emotional. It could be, reflection or judgment. So depending on, again, what you want to communicate to learners as far as what you want them to do, you can do so by choosing verbs in the correct learning domain. And here are some specific examples for objectives that indicate which domain we're working within. So within the cognitive domain, we could use an objective that says calculate medication dosage based on patient weight. Then if we wanted to move to the next skill, we would want our learners to be able to show that they're able to complete. Within the psychomotor domain, we could ask our learners, they would need to be able to demonstrate that they can administer medication according to institution protocol. And then in the affective domain, again, that's the more reflective, that's judgment, appreciation. We could indicate what we want our learners to be able to display. For example, they need to accept clinical site assignments and additional tasks willingly. So I've provided a reference here for you that's a list of verbs that are organized by domain so that you could better indicate what performance you want your learners to be able to display at the end of a unit or a course. Moving on to the next part of our objective recipe is the conditions. Where or how will students be able to perform the action that you've indicated with the performance verb? So by using a condition, this states any factors that are associated with performance. So these are the general statements that you might see at the beginning of a list of objectives. So for example, at the conclusion of this course, at the end of this module. And so this is where, again, if it's something specific and you have objectives that pertain only to a specific setting, you would want to indicate that in your conditions. So the bottom two conditions I have listed over on the right, following clinical hours or given a case study, that gives more information to the learner that you will be supplying something specific so that they can show mastery of their performance. The final part of our objective recipe is indicating the criteria, or how do the learners show achievement of an objective you've set forth for them. So the criteria states the acceptable level, and oftentimes we don't see this specifically listed in an objective because their performance may be dictated by a different policy or procedure that's just understood because you may have department-specific guidelines or course-specific guidelines that are stated in either your syllabus or student handbook. So a couple of examples of criteria that would be all-encompassing and wouldn't necessarily need to be stated in an objective are the passing grade that's required for a course or a passing grade that's required for an exam. But if you have specific criteria, be sure to include them. If you have an objective that's a little bit different from the other ones, be sure to state the criteria if it's specific to that objective. And a couple of examples here are if they need to perform something with 100% accuracy. So maybe you have an exam policy where they need a 75% to pass an exam. However, if you're having them do a specific activity, like for example in the laboratory, we may say if you're doing blood types, you need to, as part of your assessment in the student lab skills, you need to perform 5 ABO types with 100% accuracy. There may be a time requirement. So for example, again, speaking laboratory science, you have to perform a normal patient differential within 10 minutes. So again, if you have specific criteria to better inform your learners what criteria they need to meet to show achievement, be sure to state that within your objective. So at this point, I've showed you my three-step recipe for writing objectives, but I have found some people, they like models. That's a little more meaningful to them. So this is an example of a different model for writing objectives that's in line with the recipe that I provided on the previous slides. So the ABCD model is one way to remember everything that you have to include in an objective in order to better inform your students. So the A stands for audience, and this is always the student. So that's usually assumed, and that's why the previous examples that I had did not necessarily specifically state student, because they're directed towards the learners. Behavior, that's our performance verb. That's the B part of the model. C is the condition. So again, that's specific to the situation. It's where or how you want the learners to be able to display that they've achieved the behavior that you've indicated by your objective. And then again, the degree. This is the criteria. It's what students have to be able to perform or show in order to display that they have mastered whatever activity you have provided for them. So ABCD is another way for you to remember how to construct an objective. So now that I've shown you the recipe for objectives and a model for writing objectives, let's take a look at the objectives that I have set forth for us within this activity. So I have, at the conclusion of this course, participants will be able to, that's my condition. So I have stated the conditions in which I want participants to be able to display mastery. So state the purpose of learning objectives. So that is an action verb, state. That indicates what I want learners to be able to do based on that objective. Explain, that's an action verb. Write, again, that's an action verb. And develop, that's an action verb. And you can see how my verbs have gotten more complex as we go down the list. So first, state would be more knowledge comprehension. Explain would be, again, comprehension. Write, that's application. So we're moving across the taxonomy level. And develop, that's more synthesis, evaluation. So that's where you're kind of putting things all together and you're displaying that you understand what you're able to do at the end of this module. I do not have any degree or conditions in here because it's understood that if this were a learning situation where I was applying a grade, the syllabus policies would apply. If a syllabus policy did not apply to any of these objectives, I would need to include that condition within a specific objective, again, to better inform learners what it is I expect of them at the end of this course. One of the most common questions I hear from new instructors when they're trying to write objectives is, how many do I need? Do I need to cover everything? How do I know when to stop? And so my suggestion or advice that I will give you is to follow the KISS method. And keep it simple, Sally. You don't have to list everything. So some things that would help direct, how far do you have to drill down when you're providing objectives for what you want your learners to be able to know? Consider that prerequisite knowledge doesn't have to be stated unless it's a specific condition. So, for example, students that come into the laboratory science program, they need to have taken statistics. And so then if we are working in a module where we're doing math, I would not need to list all of anything that related to statistical analysis that should have been covered as part of general education courses that needed to be completed prior to coming to the laboratory science program, unless it's something that they specifically need to be able to do because I'm asking them to do it on an exam. So other things, and I know that's very vague, but that's something where you can, as an instructor, you need to be able to draw a line in the sand. So look at your learners and what prerequisite knowledge that you are asking them to come in with, and then build your objectives based on that as a starting point. I understand that a student who's coming to this program is going to have or should have this level of knowledge. So the objectives that I'm writing are going to be specific to what I'm going to have them do as a result of my instruction. So again, think about that earlier slide. One of the questions that I indicated that is good for you to consider is, what does a learner who completes this module or course look like at the end of instruction? And that's how you state that through writing your objectives. Other ideas, especially if you're a new instructor and you haven't had a lot of experience in writing objectives, look at the textbooks that you're going to be using to teach your course. Look at standards that may be indicated for your profession. Those can give you some ideas, and maybe competency statements or outcome statements that come from your accreditor that are specific to your educational program. Exam competencies, maybe if you're teaching in the nursing program, for a student to be able to take a certification or a licensure exam, that exam may list specific competencies, so you can use those as a guide. Here's what I want my learners to eventually get to, and then remember those taxonomy levels. So the exam competencies are going to list very high level competencies, because this is a student at the end of a program who's getting ready to enter the profession. So you can use those higher level competencies as a guide, and then choose lower taxonomy level verbs to help indicate how your students are going to gain knowledge as they move through a course or move through a program. Another thing that you can consider is to begin with the end in mind. So this is also called backwards design. So a lot of times, and it depends on what I'm teaching, but sometimes I kind of know what I'm going to need learners to be able to do to display mastery. For one unit, I know I'm going to give them case studies. So they need to be able to complete a case study, and so I would direct my objectives for more application level or synthesis level objectives. Maybe I know the end of this unit or module is going to be a multiple choice exam or a discussion. So then I would write my objectives based on that activity. So think about what you want your students to look like at the end, or what activities you're going to use to assess a student. Maybe it's something hands-on, so then you're going to be looking more in that psychomotor domain of learning, and use verbs accordingly. So think about what you want that student to look like at the end of a unit, and how you're going to assess the students to show that they've achieved the objectives, to help you write the objectives to guide them as far as what they're going to do. And then you would create activities to help meet that end goal, or help the learners show mastery of that particular unit or course. And just a little bit more information here on this backwards design. As a new instructor, I found backwards design to be exceptionally helpful for me, especially I had inherited a course. And I was given, okay, here's your exams, here's the activities that you're going to have students do throughout this course, but we need you to write some new objectives for it. So, and here's your course level objectives, now go. So in terms of backward design, you can kind of start with your course level objectives. What do you want students to be able to achieve within the entire course? And then you break that down into units or modules, and write objectives with the end goal in mind for each of those units or modules. And again, think about how those unit or module objectives feed into the higher level course objectives. And then you can determine what activities feed into that goal, or into your units or module objectives. Those activities can then help you determine performance, and then you can apply the ABCD model of writing objectives. That sounds simple, right? Well, as an instructor, I know that sounds great, but that's kind of hard to do. So over on the right-hand side of this slide, I've given you some ideas. So let's say, for example, at the end of Module 1, you're going to have students complete an exam. An exam is best used to assess that knowledge or comprehension taxonomy level. So you would want to use more objectives that point to students being able to define or recall or describe information that applies. And then a discussion. That may be an activity that you would like them to do within another module, a later module within the course. That speaks to more of the comprehension taxonomy level. So again, the learner is getting more sophisticated at this point. So you may ask your students to explain something or summarize something. Next is case studies or simulation, which are best suited for application or analysis level taxonomies. So at this point, this may be something where you hit mid or even at the end of a course, you want your students to be able to apply or show that they're able to do something through a demonstration. Appraisal means that they're given a situation and they have to see did the situation meet all of the criteria that are set forth in instruction that you've given them in previous modules. Discrimination, so was this good? Was this bad? So higher level learning. And then finally, final projects or comprehension exams, even portfolios, those are the higher level synthesis and evaluation taxonomies. And so again, your performance verbs for your objectives are going to indicate more complex demonstrations. So assembling, designing, appraising. So this shows that students are able to put different levels of information together and conclude. So sometimes it's easiest to begin with the end in mind and then work backwards. So if you know what your final project or your comprehensive exam is going to look like, then set up units or modules that help your students stair step into that final activity. And that can help you better write your objectives to give learners more information. So here's an example that I've provided to you. So if I look over in my activity section on the right, in one of my courses, I know in Module 1, I want them to be able to apply what they've covered in a previous immunology course to a specific situation that we've presented in Module 1. And so I like tables. I want a student to be able to construct a table within their homework and to show me that they can categorize information correctly. And then I also know that later on this is going to be an exam question. So it's going to be a multiple choice exam question. So the module objective that relates to this activity is compare and contrast. So that's very well suited for a table where you can have IgM in one column, IgG, and then list all of the different criteria within the table. And that feeds into the broader course objective where I want students to be able to relate immunology principles to basic principles within the blood bank. The second example, this activity is a case study. It's one that's going to show up in a later module because this is a more complex level of learning. A good old exam question. We always want them to be able to answer multiple choice exam questions. But the verb that I've chosen for the module objective is to interpret. So I'm going to give them a case study that has test results. And I need them to be able to interpret those test results and make a determination based on those test results. And that feeds into the higher course level objective that I want them to be able to interpret results for all immunohematology testing procedures. So in this way, you can if you have an activity in mind, because this is very well suited for what I need the learner to be able to demonstrate, you can work backwards and stair step and help your learners understand how they are going to get to that point of showing the performance that will display mastery. All right, so you're to this point and you say, okay, Brenda, that's all well and good, but I still don't know what I'm doing. So one trick that I have found that helps me to, better visualize, better state, what exactly is it? What do I want that learner to look like at the end of a module or at the end of a course? And there's something that's called a learning intention that is a little bit, it's different language than an objective. We'll call it a kinder, gentler way to tell my learners, this is my intent on your learning, and this is how you're going to show me that you understand the objective. So on this slide, I have paired an objective with a learning intention. So, keeping in mind the backwards design, I start with the end in mind. So what do I want students to be able to do within the module where we discuss ABO blood groups? So I want them to pay attention to the genes that drive the formation of the different blood group, the ABO blood group system, and how the antigens are formed. Then if I give them a phenotype of a patient, I want them to be able to predict the genotype, including information from family studies. And so an objective that would correspond to that learning intention is discuss. I want them to be able to discuss the inheritance of the ABO blood group system. So that's a simpler objective, but when it's paired with that learning intention, that gives more information to the student. Hey, here is what I specifically want you to be able to do. And then the learning objective, or the learning intention for the second objective, which is, again, if you look at this objective, it says list characteristics of the ABO red cell antigens. Well, what does that mean? What characteristics do you specifically want to look at, oh teacher? And so the learning intention here provides a little more information to the learner. I want antigen characteristics. They're used to interpret results and help explain test results. So some important characteristics include, and there's a bulleted list there. So again, this thinking about what is your intention of the learning that you're designing, that can help you as the instructor decide, okay, here's the objective that I want to want to share with my learners so that they are better informed as far as what the performance looks like for this module or for this course. So being able to verbalize your learning intentions is one way to communicate to students or help students better understand how to use objectives. The resource that I have listed at the bottom of this slide, and there's more information in the references section at the end of this presentation, was a study that was done. It was a qualitative study done on science students who are in college. And they looked specifically at how students used objectives to help them study within their college level science courses. And so they asked students, how do you use them? And some of the answers that they got were students who used their objectives formulated them into questions they could answer. Other students used the objectives as an outline or also as a way to self-assess. So they looked at the list of objectives and, okay, I know this one, so I should be prepared for what activity, whatever activity my instructor is going to give me. And so then they asked students the next question, why do you find objectives helpful? And so some of the responses that they received were it helped the students to narrow down, what information do I have to know? You gave me 70 pages to read. What is the most important information that you need me to focus on? It also helped them to organize their studying, because again, using it as an outline. And it was also a way for the instructor to communicate information to that student. Again, here's what's important. I know there's a lot of stuff here, but here's the most important things that you need to take away from this lesson based on the objectives that I've provided. So then they also asked students the question, why don't you use them? And some students felt that objectives weren't necessary, they weren't a priority, or they didn't feel that they were helpful. And the thing that all instructors just love to hear, because I've spent all of this time writing objectives, I did not know that we had them or what they are. And so lessons learned from this resource that I provided to you, how do we help students use objectives? Like I said on the previous slide, if I spend a lot of time writing objectives, I would like my students to use them. This is a way for me to communicate, hey, this is what's important for you to be able to do so that you will be successful in this course. And so what are things that as an instructor I can do to help students? And I think the number one thing is often as instructors, because this is the nuts and bolts of creating instruction, is often writing the objectives. We may assume that because we spend so much time on them, students know what they are and how to use them. And so what I am finding, especially more and more with my younger students, is students don't always know what objectives are and what their intent of them is. So that is hint number one, is don't assume your students know what they are. It may be of value to take a few minutes and, hey, exam number 1 is coming up. You just started this program. Let's talk a little bit about how I communicate with you as an instructor. So here are some suggestions from me on how you can use my objectives to better study for an exam or prepare for an activity, and then show them how to use them. Take an objective and turn it into a question. Here's how I would study if I were you. Here's my objective. Can you answer this question that I have formulated from the objective? And look here, I have a list of objectives. You can use them as an outline. So maybe go through and highlight all of the important points that correspond to my lectures or whatever chapters I have given you to read. And then you can use it to create a self-assessment for yourself. So based on those words that you've highlighted, do you know what they are? Have you read them? Did I cover them in a lecture? And finally, this activity is not pointed specifically at the learners, but back at the instructor who's creating the learning activity. Make sure your learning activities are aligned with your instructional activities, because if they're not, then what you are telling your students is these objectives are really meaningless and don't even look at them. And so if you've spent a lot of time writing your objectives, you definitely want your students to use them. And so alignment is one way for you to show students, hey, I'm helping you help yourself. So here's some objectives to help you better understand what you need to demonstrate to show mastery. Another thing that you can do is, remember back when I told you learning intentions could help you as an instructor better decide, here's the objective that I want them to be able to do. If you've spent time writing those learning intentions, include them in your information to your students. So here I have included, this is a table that is directed to my EDD students in one of the courses that I teach. So I have developed learning intentions that better explain, here's the objective, but here's what I intend for you to be able to do to showcase your learning. So in this table, the top 2 objectives are going to be assessed based on this verbal discussion platform. So I've grouped them together. I've got a complex discussion question here that's going to encompass 2 different objectives. Number 3, or the compare and contrast objective, I want students to write something to explore how we're talking about evaluation and assessment. We're going to explore it, and they're going to compare and contrast and showcase their learning on a written discussion board. And then the final objective, explain. If you look at all of these verbs, they're not terribly complex, but I'm providing information in the learning intentions on here's how we're going to apply, or here's what we're going to do with these objectives. So in this way, it's just an extra layer or another way for me to communicate to my learners, here's my objective and here's my intent with how you're going to showcase your learning based on the objectives that I've provided. So if you find learning intentions are a good way for you as an instructor to help develop objectives or activities, I would encourage you to go ahead and include them in the information that you're providing to your students. Over on the objective side, the CLO 2s and the 2, 3, 4s, CLO stands for course, learning objective. And so in this way, these objectives are in one module. So in this way, I'm showing how these objectives align with my course level objectives. Again, just to showcase to students that what you're doing is relevant and how it feeds into the bigger picture as far as what they are going to accomplish at the end of a course. Another approach that I've seen that can be very helpful for learners is called feed up, feedback, and feed forward. So feed up, that step means that you have provided students with information at the beginning of a module or a course, and you've given them objectives, and then you've asked them to respond back to you so that they can show you they understand what it is they are going to be doing at the end of that module or unit or course to demonstrate mastery, or how they're going to demonstrate their learning to you. So this is a good way, because we write instructions, and it seems clear to us because we're invested in it. This is a good way for you as the instructor to definitely see, do my students understand what it is that I want them to do? And so you can handle issues on the front end. So if a student indicates something completely different from what your intent is, you can help them better understand that early on in the learning process. And then as you work through the module or activity or whatever, you can respond to the work that your students provide to you, either in a formative or a summative manner. So if you're working on a project where students are turning in little snippets of a project as they work through maybe a whole course or a module, you can provide them feedback, and then that can help them adjust their work or their activity. And then at the feed forward step, that's really a summative step. That's at the end of the module or at the end of a instructional course, and this is where you're asking students, how did things work out for you? Kind of tell me how you feel your performance went, and then how can I as the instructor help you? So again, it's a way for the students to be more active instead of sitting there and being passive vessels. Teach me via the objectives what it is that I need to be able to know. You're asking, and this is especially good for adult students that are typically found in health sciences educational programs, to take charge of their learning a little bit more, help them become more invested, and tell you how you can help them learn. So in online learning situations, this formative, summative kind of inquiry, this feed up and feedback type of steps, is often called, how's my driving? So I've given you some examples because the previous slide, that sounds like a good idea, but what does this look like? So here's some examples of how you can include this in an online program, but you could also include this in a face-to-face. If these are questions that you could easily incorporate into an activity online, but you could also hand out pieces of paper to students at the beginning that ask them, all right, we're starting a new unit. How excited are you? And what do you hope to achieve? And you as the learner, how are you going to show me that you understand all this material at the end of the unit? And then at the end of the unit, you can ask additional questions, the reflection, and we're kind of getting a little into the affective domain here, but you're asking for students to self-reflect. How do you feel about what you did? And what's something that I can do as an instructor to help support your learning? You have to be prepared for the grouchy student, but the hope is that you will get some good feedback that lets the learner indicate, hey, I got it, this is awesome, or no, I need a little bit more help. And so these questions at the beginning of the unit or the module, this is the feed up. This helps ensure that your learners understand exactly what it is that you want them to do, and is also a way for you to provide feedback. Oftentimes, students want more interaction with their students, but they may be uncomfortable in talking with an instructor. They're scared. This is an authority figure. I don't want to bother them. They're very, very busy. But in this way, you're asking them, please help me help you. And then at the end of the module, again, this is an opportunity for you to assure your learners, hey, maybe you didn't get 100%, but you did really, really good. And here's how we're going to apply what you've learned going forward. And then, did you use the objectives to study? was there a better way for me to communicate? Were the objectives unclear? We did that feed up thing, but maybe through the course, was there something that I could have done to help support your learning? And then, we've all had that activity that we were super excited about and it just blew up in our face. So you can decide, hey, I'll never do that again, or, that was pretty awesome. I do want to continue to use this activity, but here's how I'll tweak it going forward. And so we have made it to the summary part of this presentation. So what we've learned through the course of this is, objectives are required for a variety of reasons. It could be the instructor or the institution. It could be your accreditor. It could be you need them and you just want them. But no matter the reason why you have to include objectives, writing them is a very instructor-intensive process. And one thing that I usually tell my students, and I tell my EDD students, is I've been teaching for a while, but oftentimes I don't feel really confident about a course until I've taught it at least 3 times. And if that's you're talking about a course that maybe you teach only once a year, that's a significant time investment before you really feel good about the objectives that you've written. So just recognize that objectives are very instructor intensive, and it's okay. They're always going to be tweaked. They don't have to be perfect. If you are teaching, no matter what health sciences educational setting you're teaching in, use all of the available resources that you have. In laboratory science, we have something that's called a body of knowledge that is produced, and it's a bunch of objectives, and instructors can use those to, hey, this is what's expected of my students to look like. This is what a graduate looks like at the end of the program. I can use these objectives to help me stair step. This is how we're going to get you to look like an entry-level employee. And then as instructors, again, a lot of times I think we assume that learners know what objectives are and how to use them. And, 10 or 15 minutes spent at the beginning of a course or the beginning of a program, wherever you put it, that's time well spent so that your learners know, here's how I'm using the objectives, here's what I do with them, and here's how you can use them to be the best student you can be. And finally, here are the references that I used to develop this presentation. So you have the information to look up anything you would like to study for your own personal development. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.